Lynn, who will be speaking for us, is actually a member of Edinburgh CND. I think I can call you that, can't I, Lynn?
Yes, of course.
But probably more famous for being the present chair of Scottish CND. And she's going to be talking to us about nuclear power and its role in a sustainable future Scotland, which, or not role, whichever way you want to look at it. You'll probably be saying something about Hunterston as well, won't you, Lynn, will you?
Yes, I will. Indeed.
Yeah, because of course that's a sort of big news thing on the nuclear power front. Like a few other people in this meeting, I'm also a member of an organisation called Scotty3, and perhaps Pete will put the details of that in the chat as well, because that's environment, which way around is it? Economy, energy and environment, the E3, I think that's right, but it looks, you can correct me in the chat if you like, but that also looks at the area of sustainable futures and just transitions and things like that, and is also obviously has strong feelings about nuclear power. Okay, so if I could pass over to you, Lynn.
Okay, right. Despite having managed to write my name in very large letters on this slide, I want to stress that I'm not, in a sense, I'm a lay person like everybody else, unless you happen to be a nuclear physicist or engineer. So I'm not a scientific expert on nuclear power at all in that sense, but I am an educated reader, as we all can be. So this is not, I'm not trying to set myself up as an expert. This is my view based on my reading of the literature. And this is an area in which I think there are very strong opinions that are often blind. They're not necessarily interested in factual basis for things, and there's a lot of cover up and secrecy. So it's tricky, and of course I come at it with an interest in nuclear weapons, which I'll get onto in a minute because of the connection between the two. But this is what's happening at the moment. There's a very strong push from the nuclear industry to advocate for new nuclear power, and obviously there is a power station currently under construction in England. The Scottish government has had a commitment to not building new nuclear power stations in Scotland, but if you read carefully what is said about nuclear power on the Scottish government website, you will find that it's not set against these small, what are being called small modular reactors. And this is Rolls-Royce advertising from Rolls-Royce's website. And if you paid attention to the recent announcement of funding by Boris Johnson, there were, I think it was about 100 million set aside for research and development of these small modular reactors. So at the moment, the nuclear industry is trying to push this particular development, arguing that what we need are much smaller nuclear reactors across the country, supplying our power. And I would basically say that all of the issues, all of the reasons why, for me, nuclear power cannot be part of the future of a sustainable Scotland, apply whether you're talking about small modular nuclear reactors or the kind of reactors that we currently have and are currently still operating, including in Scotland. And I guess because of my own politics, I always start really with the link to the nuclear weapons. But these other issues, I'm going to try and just say a little bit about each of these issues. And actually at this point, Pete, I should just check how long you're expecting me to talk for. And if you've got a clear time limit and I'm speaking for too long, to just ask you to interrupt me, because I don't think I ever did completely know how long I was meant to talk for. But so just feel free to tell me to be quiet at any point. That's fine. So and also feel free to interrupt.
25 minutes actually.
Sorry?
I think we said 20 to 25 minutes.
Right. Okay. Right. So I'll speed up. Mainly I've got pictures, although I've got this slide's got a lot of words on it, and I've got one other with a lot of words on it. So maybe you won't speak about all of these at any length, but so just to start with the link to nuclear weapons, basically the stuff of nuclear bombs is generated by civil nuclear power. And in the UK, because of reprocessing that went on at Sellafield for decades, we've got this enormous stockpile of plutonium, which is just it's an enormous headache, and it will have to be looked after for thousands of years. And this is this picture of its storage at Sellafield. But basically, around the world, nuclear power and nuclear weapons have been linked. Now, this is one of my other things with a huge amount of words on it. So this is two academics at the University of Sussex have written this very recent paper, and the URL is there. Professor Stirling and Dr. Johnston, talking about the connections between the current UK nuclear civil nuclear power industry and the UK nuclear weapons program, and particularly the submarine propulsion, which is also nuclear. The submarines that carry out nuclear bombs are nuclear powered, and arguing that actually the skills, the infrastructure, the training, at all kinds of levels, the weapons industry needs a vibrant civil nuclear power industry to be survivable, to have the person power, the know-how, and the infrastructures that it needs. So there's quite a strong argument there that even if we now have got so much plutonium, we'll never need civil nuclear power to make bomb material. And even if this country continues down the foolishness of carrying on with nuclear bombs and wanted that, it doesn't need civil nuclear power for it, but it still needs it for training and know-how. So the history, of course, has always been interlinked. So although when you go back to the 50s, there was this notion of atoms for peace, which was written into the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of the 60s, the way that nuclear weapons have spread around the world have actually been through nuclear power. And the countries, like this is India's first nuclear test, an underground test in the 70s, never did sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but made the transition from nuclear power to nuclear weapons. And this was a nuclear facility in Iraq that was bombed in 1981 by Israel. Now, at the time of that bombing, the day of that bombing, I was a chair of Edinburgh Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and we were in a meeting having a debate in what was the trade union place down in Picardy Place, and we were debating whether to oppose Edinburgh CND would take a position against nuclear power. And it was being argued by somebody that there was no connection. And Israel did not accept this argument. That evening, they demonstrated that by bombing this nuclear facility sold to Iraq by the French as a civil nuclear power station. And of course, Israel itself, it's never acknowledged being a nuclear state, but is known, was already well established as a nuclear state. Okay, so that's, at those several levels, there is this connection that will always continue. So Scotland currently has these two nuclear power stations, Hunterston and Torness. They're both advanced gas cooled reactors. And Hunterston is now one of the oldest nuclear power stations in Europe. I think it's one of the two oldest. They're both owned and operated now by this Électricité de France, EDF Energy, subsidiary of a French, basically state-owned company. Now, as you know, well, Hunterston is now operating. Having been offline all of last winter, the Office of Nuclear Regulation allowed it to restart in September. And it could only allow it to restart by basically moving the goalposts of what was safe in terms of the number of cracks within the graphite core of the reactor. So both the two reactors of Hunterston are very cracked, and there is also the cracking is sufficiently extensive that debris starts to fall down, and I'll show you some illustrations. But the Office of Nuclear Regulation shifted the number of cracks that were considered safe. Now, all of this is based on very complex models and estimates. It's estimates, guesstimates, safety levels. That's not to say that I think there is a very, very high risk that this thing is going to go terribly wrong any minute. But nevertheless, why take any risk when you have a nuclear power station on the west coast of Scotland, where if the prevailing wind is southwesterly right across the central belt, if there were to be an accident, it would be utterly cataclysmic. But part of the drive to make it allowed to operate, even if it's only for another 6 months or another 12 months, is financial. EDF is in serious financial difficulty, as the civil nuclear industry is in general. And if Hunterston were stopped now, it would set the precedent for how long the others are allowed to run, because they're all the same kind of reactor, all of them in the UK. They're all going to have this cracking problem. Torness is predicted to start cracking long before they want it to shut down. It's going to start cracking in 2022, but they want it to keep going to 2030. So this cracking problem has got a big financial implication for EDF, and they have a vested interest in keeping it running. But so too maybe does the whole nuclear industry. Like minimizing risk has been the history of the whole industry. So these are the graphite, this is what the graphite core is made up of, these kinds of bricks. So the fuel rods go down inside these bricks, and gas cooling the fuel rods goes down inside these bricks. And that is what's happening when they're cracking. And it is thought to make the whole core less stable, but maybe even more likely in terms of the possibility of accident is that the fuel rods and the control rods that stop the reactor, if there's enough debris falls into them, they might not move up and down smoothly, and therefore control of the reactor would be affected. Okay, so of course there have been spectacular accidents. We know about Chernobyl. This is a map of the cesium-137 contamination after the accident in 86, taken 10 years later in 96. And there was still contamination in parts of Scotland. And you know that sheep couldn't be sold in Scotland in some parts of Dumfries and Galloway for more than a decade after the accident. And we'll never know exactly how many cancers were caused. And we know about Fukushima and the fact that that accident is still leaking radiation into the Pacific and will continue to cause problems for many, many, many years to come. So when an accident happens, it can be cataclysmic, even if the risk of it is very small. Now, there have been accidents in the UK that have been quite serious. So the Windscale fire, the explosion of a shaft at Dounreay. There was a near accident in 1998 at Hunterston that you know isn't often brought up and remembered, but actually in the Christmas holidays when staff were on a kind of skeleton and not available to deal with an emergency, there was a storm that brought down the power lines and the cooling system failed. And if you leave a reactor uncooled for long enough, then meltdown is the consequence. And they had to get emergency staff teams onto the place in terrible weather conditions, and it all took many more hours than were comfortable. So, you know, it wasn't the catastrophe it could have been, but it just shows you, you know, how possible it is. It just takes that chain of unexpected events for these things to spiral. But more, I think more fundamental maybe than the risk of accidents is the everyday ongoing way that these advanced gas-cooled reactors operate means that at reasonably regular intervals, there is going to be a spike of radioactivity in the very immediate environment. Now, if you are a pregnant woman or an infant, a spike of radioactivity is not good news. And there is a huge debate still about leukemia clusters around nuclear power stations, but it's generally widely accepted by scientists who are not making acts of faith because of their relationship with the nuclear industry, that it is very plausibly the cause of the leukemia clusters is radiation and these spikes. And these spikes are only known about partly because of Germany, because it takes hour by hour mapping of radioactivity to see this, because if you use annual statistics, it seems well within the safety levels and spikes are not seen. But the spikes have to occur whenever you remove the fuel rods, and then the gas that is the coolant just goes into the atmosphere. And fuel rods are routinely removed when there's inspections and shutdowns. So it's not a completely infrequent thing. It might be happening about once a year, but you would never know it. And the industry doesn't ever speak of it. And that's part of why, you know, I don't think they've yet come clean. They may not be doing the kind of concealment they did with the Windscale fire, and then they changed the name to Sellafield. They're still not coming clean. So childhood leukemias are, you know, it's still a contentious thing. But like I said, there's a lot of scientists are convinced that they are linked. So just to finish with this other completely overworded, and so these two issues are probably the most directly relevant to the issue of sustainability. And the claim, if we went back to the beginning, for the small modular nuclear reactors is that they would be part of the solution to carbon our problem of carbon footprint and global warming. And the claim that nuclear power is zero carbon is often made by the industry. And again, this is not a complete truth. And so this is an academic, an engineer, an American from Stanford, and this is a recent, these points are just lifted directly from his paper, where he is making a comparison between nuclear power plants and onshore wind and what he's calling utility solar. So he makes a comparison both in terms of the cost and in terms of the cost per kilowatt hour, the length of time it takes to build them, which of course also means delay in what they're delivering. And but he also makes the comparison in terms of carbon footprint and carbon emissions, and is basically concluding that in emissions, new nuclear are so many times more than wind power or solar power. And it's partly because he's looking at the whole cycle. So he's also looking at uranium mining, the cost of the construction, but it's not just that. When it's actually running, it's giving off vapor, water vapor that is contributing also to global warming. So it's several factors that if you try to take everything into account and look at the whole of a process of an industry, you can come to the conclusion that there is no such thing. There's no zero carbon for any industry, but nuclear power is certainly not zero, and it is emitting more than wind, wave, and solar. Okay, so basically that's me. I'll stop there.